Every nation on the planet is drowning in debt. America's sitting on $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. When you add it all up across the globe, we're talking about $315 trillion. 3 times what the entire world economy produces in a year. But here's what should keep you up at night. If literally everyone's in debt, who the hell are they all paying? The answer is going to mess with your head. Because once you start tracing back who these creditors actually are, once you follow the money to its source, you're going to find something deeply unsettling. The planet doesn't owe this money to some specific entity. It owes the money to itself. But here's the thing. 4 individuals, 4 financial architects spanning 300 years, engineered it to work exactly this way. On purpose. They constructed a framework where the debt never gets paid down, where nations borrow in perpetuity, where interest payments flow upward without end, and where the architects of this trap profit from every single payment, every single crisis, every single rescue package. This isn't some wild theory. This is recorded, verifiable history. The meetings took place, the agreements were signed, the operational mechanisms are matters of public documentation, and when you understand how they assembled this machine, you'll realize why 38 trillion isn't something to fix. It's the machine operating precisely as they intended. Let me walk you through the 4 builders, the 4 critical moments when this debt trap got engineered, and why every single government on this planet is now locked inside with zero way out. Before 1694 rolled around, monarchs borrowed money the straightforward way. They'd approach wealthy merchants or nobility, promise to pay them back with interest added on. And if the money didn't come through, they'd default. The lenders would take the loss. The king would find someone else willing to lend. It carried risk for the people with money and caused embarrassment for rulers. But the damage stayed localized. Debt existed temporarily. You either settled it or you didn't. The system would reset itself. Then, William Patterson flipped everything on its head. This Scottish merchant and financial operator had attempted multiple schemes to build wealth and failed every single time. In 1691, he conceived an idea that would fundamentally alter civilization. England found itself at war with France. King William III desperately needed capital. The treasury sat empty. Tax collections couldn't cover what the war demanded, and the usual lenders were turning down new loans because England had a history of not paying people back. Patterson went to the king with a proposition. He would rally a consortium of affluent merchants willing to lend the government £1.2 million. In current money, we're talking roughly $300 million. A staggering amount. But here's where it gets interesting. This loan would never actually be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest on it forever. 8% every single year. And to administer this arrangement, Patterson suggested establishing something entirely new, the Bank of England. The operational structure was groundbreaking. The merchant lenders would hand over their gold to this new Bank of England. The bank would then lend that gold to the government. The government would pay annual interest out of tax collections, and the bank would distribute that interest back to the original merchant lenders. But here's the detail that changes everything. The government would never pay back the actual principal, ever. The loan existed in perpetuity. Why would merchants agree to this arrangement? Because Parliament guaranteed the interest payment. It had the backing of the government's authority to tax its citizens. As long as England maintained the ability to collect taxes, the interest would keep flowing. And those banknotes the lenders received in exchange for their gold, they could be traded freely. They functioned as money itself, actually better than money, because they generated interest returns. Parliament greenlit Patterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England received its charter. The merchants delivered their gold. The government secured its war financing. And for the first time in recorded history, National debt transformed into something permanent, not something requiring a solution, but an intentional feature of how the system operated. And here's the part nobody bothers explaining about why this was absolute genius for the banking class. The government paid 8% annual interest on that £1.2 million. That works out to £96,000 per year, forever. The merchants had effectively purchased a perpetual annuity from the government itself. As long as England continued to exist, as long as it maintained its taxing authority, the money kept coming. And if any of them wanted their gold back, they could simply sell the banknotes to someone else. The debt could be transferred between parties, but never actually repaid. But Patterson's true brilliance showed up in what happened next. The Bank of England received authorization to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt obligations. They could literally print paper money up to the value of the outstanding loan. This created currency out of debt itself. The government's promise to pay became actual money circulating in the economy. And the more the government borrowed, the more money could enter circulation. This is the blueprint. Government takes on debt, never pays back the principal, pays interest indefinitely, and the debt itself transforms into the money supply. It's brilliant if you're a banker extracting interest. It's devastating if you're a taxpayer, because you're servicing debt that will never disappear. Within 50 years, every major power in Europe copied this exact model. France established the Banque Générale. The Netherlands already operated sophisticated banking networks, but formalized their government debt systems. And by 1790, the freshly independent United States implemented the identical framework. Alexander Hamilton, we've discussed him before, explicitly based America's financial architecture on the Bank of England template. Permanent debt, interest funded through taxation, bonds circulating as currency. Patterson died in 1719, not especially wealthy despite creating the Bank of England. But the system he engineered, still running strong 331 years later. The Bank of England continues to operate. British government debt has never been eliminated. It's been restructured, rolled forward, expanded continuously, but never actually paid off. The trap got set in 1694, and every government since then has walked straight into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European powers had fully embraced debt financing. They borrowed for military campaigns, for building infrastructure, for basic operations. But no organized marketplace existed. Each loan required individual negotiation. Interest rates fluctuated wildly, and only the absolute wealthiest merchants could participate in the game. Until one family industrialized the entire operation and made escape impossible. Nathan Rothschild changed everything. He industrialized sovereign debt, turned it into a factory operation. The Rothschild family began as money changers and traders operating out of Frankfurt. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild brothers had planted banking operations in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was completely unprecedented. They could transfer money across international borders faster than anyone else on the continent. And they leveraged this capability to completely dominate sovereign debt issuance. Nathan Rothschild, working out of London, was the tactical mastermind. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan orchestrated loans for the British government. But his innovation wasn't just lending, it was how he structured the entire operation. Instead of directly lending to governments, he would purchase government bonds at a discounted rate, then turn around and resell them to investors at a markup. He created what we now call a secondary market. Governments needed immediate cash. Rothschild provided it instantly. Then he would sell those bonds to pension funds, insurance operations, and wealthy private individuals. The government got fast money. Rothschild collected the spread between what he paid and what he sold for, and investors received an asset they could trade freely. But here's where the operation gets darker. Rothschild didn't just finance governments. He positioned himself so that governments had zero choice but to use his services. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild famously received confirmation of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His private courier network outpaced official government channels. He weaponized this information advantage to manipulate the bond market systematically. First, he started selling British bonds heavily, sending a signal to the market that Britain was losing the war. Bond prices crashed hard. Other investors panicked and dumped their holdings. Then, after prices had completely collapsed, Rothschild quietly bought massive quantities at rock-bottom valuations. When official news of the British victory arrived the following day, bond prices exploded upward. Rothschild made millions, not from what we'd call insider trading today, but from controlling information flow and timing the market perfectly. This established what became known as the Rothschild model. Control the information networks, control the issuance process, control the entire market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt completely. If any government needed to borrow money, they went through the Rothschilds, because the Rothschilds controlled access to the investor networks. They owned the distribution channels, and they dictated the terms of every deal. Here's why this matters for understanding the debt trap. Before Rothschild's innovation, governments could theoretically just refuse payment. If a monarch defaulted on obligations, his creditors absorbed losses, and the system would eventually reset itself. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across international borders. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who then sold it to a German bank who pledged it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The ownership web became so intricately complex that defaulting wasn't simply refusing to pay one creditor anymore. It meant triggering the collapse of an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation in its purest form. Make debt so interconnected across borders that default becomes impossible. Not because governments suddenly became more responsible, but because default would trigger catastrophic systemic collapse. Governments became trapped in the web. They had no choice but to keep making payments. And they had to keep borrowing fresh money just to cover the interest payments on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent. It had become completely inescapable. The Rothschild family fortune peaked during the mid-1800s. They were the wealthiest family on the planet, richer than any monarch ruling at the time. And that wealth came from exactly one source: interest payments on sovereign debt flowing continuously. They didn't manufacture anything. They didn't construct anything tangible. They lent money to governments and collected interest payments forever. The system Patterson engineered in 1694, Rothschild industrialized by 1815, and every government across Europe was caught in the net. By 1900, America was rising as an economic superpower, but it still operated with a primitive financial infrastructure. Banks functioned independently from each other. The money supply remained tied directly to gold reserves, and no central mechanism existed to manage debt issuance systematically. J.P. Morgan fixed that problem, not to serve the public interest, but to protect his own banking empire. In 1907, a financial panic erupted. Stock prices went into freefall, banks started failing, and the entire economy seized up. J.P. Morgan personally organized the rescue operation. He assembled the major New York bankers inside his private library, locked the doors behind them, and forced them to pledge their own capital to stabilize the failing institutions. It worked. The panic subsided, and Morgan effectively became America's unofficial central banker. But the man was 70 years old. He understood he couldn't personally bail out the system a second time. So Morgan and his circle, the most powerful bankers operating in America, designed a permanent solution to the problem. They needed a central bank, but Americans despised central banks with a passion. The first and second banks of the United States had both been shut down by populist political movements. So Morgan's group disguised their plan. In 1910, Morgan's key associates, including Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the largest banking houses, held a covert meeting on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. For 9 straight days, they engineered the structure of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were conducted in total secrecy because they knew perfectly well that if the American public discovered that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system behind closed doors, there would be riots in the streets. The plan they devised was brilliant political manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called a Federal Reserve System. It wouldn't operate as one single institution. It would function as 12 regional banks spread across the country. It wouldn't be controlled directly by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president himself. On paper, it looked decentralized, democratic, and publicly controlled, but the actual structure guaranteed banker control at every level. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks in their districts. Those member banks elected the boards of the regional feds, and the regional feds elected members of the Federal Reserve Board. The government appointed some positions, but the banking industry controlled the entire system's operation. And the most critical power, the authority to create money and purchase government bonds, was handed to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which the largest Wall Street banks controlled. Morgan's banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed through Congress in December 1913, largely because most representatives voting on it didn't actually understand what they were approving, and immediately the debt trap expanded exponentially. Now the government wasn't just borrowing from private banks anymore. It was borrowing from the Federal Reserve itself, which possessed the power to create money out of nothing to purchase government bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt had just been created. Here's why this changes everything. Before the Federal Reserve existed, there was a natural ceiling on how much the government could borrow. Banks only had finite amounts of money available to lend, but the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds directly. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends that money into the economy, and the debt goes onto the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing except the promise that taxpayers will service it indefinitely. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt accumulation. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer standing ready for government bonds, always demand in the market, so the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over existing debt forever, because the Fed will always be there to buy it. And those interest payments flow continuously from taxpayers to the banks that own and control the Federal Reserve System. Morgan died in 1913, the exact same year his creation came to life. But his legacy lives on as the structural framework that makes the current $38 trillion in U.S. debt mathematically possible. Without the Federal Reserve acting as guaranteed buyer, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. The private market simply wouldn't support it. But with the Fed standing ready as perpetual purchaser, there's no limit to the debt. The trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the debt trap that Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan had constructed was operating globally across every developed nation. Every country borrowed continuously, rolled over existing debt, and paid interest without end. But developing nations presented a different problem. They borrowed heavily for infrastructure development, and many couldn't maintain their payment schedules. The debt trap was approaching its operational limits, until one chairman made sure it became absolutely permanent and extended it globally. Paul Volcker made the trap permanent. Volcker served as Federal Reserve Chairman from 1979 through 1987, and he walked into a serious problem. Inflation was running above 10%. American credibility on the world stage was deteriorating rapidly. Foreign governments were losing confidence in the dollar itself. He needed to crush inflation completely, even if it meant deliberately causing a recession. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate jumped from 11% all the way up to 20%, the highest level in American history. This move crushed inflation dead, but it triggered another effect that nobody was talking about publicly. Developing nations had borrowed billions of dollars throughout the 1970s when interest rates were low and money was cheap. Now those loans were coming due, and the interest rates had tripled overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil was in for $60 billion. Argentina owed $40 billion, and they couldn't make the payments. The interest obligations alone exceeded their entire export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make its scheduled payments. Default. This should have triggered a global financial meltdown. American banks had originated most of those loans. If Mexico defaulted completely, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, all of them would take catastrophic losses. Some would probably fail outright. The entire banking system stood on the edge of collapse. Volcker could have let it happen. He could have allowed the banks to absorb their losses, let the market clear itself naturally. But he didn't do that. Instead, he orchestrated a bailout operation through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and other struggling nations enough money to keep making their interest payments to American banks. These loans were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with very specific conditions attached. The conditions were absolutely brutal. Governments had to slash public spending across the board, privatize state-owned assets and sell them to foreign investors, open their markets completely to foreign investment, devalue their currencies, essentially dismantle their economic sovereignty piece by piece in exchange for the money needed to keep paying interest to foreign banks. And here's the critical part everyone misses. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt burden. They didn't forgive anything. They just rolled it over, restructured it to make the payments manageable in the short term, but made the debt itself permanent. This is Volcker's innovation at work. When debt becomes unpayable, you don't forgive it. You restructure it. You lend just enough to keep the interest payments flowing, and you extract political and economic concessions in exchange for that privilege. The debt trap transformed into a tool of direct control. Countries that couldn't pay were forced to open their entire economies, sell off their national assets, and submit to foreign economic policy dictated from Washington and New York, all in exchange for the privilege of staying trapped in debt. This exact pattern has repeated itself continuously for the past 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina again in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every single time, the same structure plays out. IMF loans to maintain interest payments, austerity measures imposed from outside, national sovereignty surrendered, and the debt never eliminated, just restructured and made perpetual. Volcker died in 2019, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap operates globally and offers no escape. Even when countries physically cannot pay, they're not permitted to default. They get refinanced into permanent indebtedness, and the interest keeps flowing to the same creditors, the same banks, the same institutional structures, the same system Patterson created back in 1694. Now let me show you exactly how these four architects built a system where debt becomes infinite and escape becomes impossible. Start with Patterson's foundational model. Government borrows money, pays interest forever, never repays the principal amount. Add Rothschild's innovation on top of that. Make the debt tradable across global markets. So it's not just one creditor you owe anymore. It's an interconnected web. Default in one location collapses the entire system. Add Morgan's mechanism into the mix. Central banks create money to purchase government bonds directly. Unlimited demand gets created. Government can always borrow more, no matter how much debt already exists. Now add Volcker's trap as the final layer. When countries physically cannot pay, you restructure instead of forgiving. You don't let them default. You keep the interest flowing, no matter what. The result is exactly what we're living with today. $315 trillion in global debt. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt. None of it will ever be repaid. All of it generates interest payments, and all of it connects through the financial system in ways that make default anywhere threaten collapse everywhere. Here's the specific mechanism in operation. The US government has issued $38 trillion in debt obligations. Who actually owns this debt? Roughly $20 trillion is owned by the American public, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve itself. These institutions purchase treasury bonds because they're considered the safest assets available. But those bonds pay interest, about $1 trillion per year. Now, that interest money comes from tax collections. So taxpayers send money to the government. The government transfers it to bondholders. And the bondholders are mostly institutions ultimately owned by the wealthy. It's a transfer mechanism from workers to capital. Every single year, forever. The other $18 trillion is owed to the government itself. Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare Trust Fund. The government borrowed from these programs and spent the money on other things. Now, it owes itself, technically, but ultimately taxpayers owe this money. Because when Social Security needs to redeem those bonds to pay benefits, the government has to either raise taxes or borrow even more money to cover the payments. It's a shell game, but the interest flows regardless of how you account for it. Now scale this globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe owes $14 trillion, mostly to European banks and the European Central Bank. China owes significant domestic debt held primarily by state-owned banks. Every country is running the identical system, and they're all interconnected with each other. Japan holds U.S. Treasury securities. The U.S. holds European bonds through IMF participation. Europe holds developing nation debt through World Bank operations. It's completely circular. Everyone owes everyone else. And the interest flows upward continuously to the institutions managing all of this debt. Here's why this can never end. If the United States paid off its entire $38 trillion in debt, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars get created when the government borrows. If it paid off the debt completely, those dollars would disappear from circulation. Deflation, depression, complete economic collapse. So the government can never pay it off. It has to keep borrowing, keep rolling over existing debt, and keep making interest payments. The same reality applies globally. If every government simultaneously paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money in circulation to conduct international trade. The entire system would seize up completely. So debt can't be eliminated. It's structural. It's necessary by the design of the system. And here's who profits from this arrangement. The institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These asset management giants control tens of trillions in assets. They purchase government bonds using other people's money, pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums. And they collect the interest, about $1 trillion per year just from US debt alone, plus interest flowing from Japan, Europe, everywhere else. That $1 trillion per year in interest payments flows directly from taxpayers to bondholders. It's the largest wealth transfer in human history. Continuous, structural, and completely invisible to most people, because it's not labeled as a tax. It's called debt service. But it's the exact same mechanism. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. Now here's the final piece of the puzzle. The four architects didn't conspire together in some secret meeting. They lived in completely different centuries, but each one solved a specific problem in a way that benefited the banking class, and each solution built directly on top of the previous one. Patterson made debt permanent back in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together, they constructed a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt portfolios, who collect the interest payments, they're the ultimate beneficiaries of this entire operation. Not governments, not taxpayers, the financial institutions. And here's the final truth nobody wants you to understand. $38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's their business model. Every single dollar of debt represents an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral for additional borrowing. It enables more debt creation. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will continue paying interest, even if it never repays the principal, the system functions exactly as designed. The debt trap is complete, and escape isn't possible. Not without collapsing the entire financial system that civilization now depends on. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system, and everyone on Earth is now caught inside it. Let's follow the money to see exactly where it goes. Take that $38 trillion in US government debt. We've established that about $20 trillion is held by what they call the public. But that's misleading language. The public in this context means institutional investors. Pension funds, managing retirement money. Mutual funds, pooling investments. Insurance companies holding reserves. Major banks. And the Federal Reserve itself, which is technically private even though it pretends to be governmental. These institutions buy treasury bonds because the system has been engineered so that government debt is treated as the safest asset class available. But safe for who? The bonds pay interest. Currently, about $1 trillion annually flows out as interest payments on that debt. Where does that $1 trillion come from? Your taxes. Every April 15th, you send money to the government. The government doesn't spend it on roads or schools or defense with that portion. It transfers it directly to bondholders as interest payments. Now, who are these bondholders? Follow the chain. Pension funds pay it out to retirees, sure. But who manages those pension funds and collects fees on every transaction? BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Who owns stock in the banks receiving interest? The same asset management giants. Who collects management fees on the mutual funds? The same players. It's not a direct transfer from your pocket to some billionaire's account. That would be too obvious. It's filtered through multiple layers of institutional structures. But the wealth flows upward consistently to the people who control the asset management system. And that other $18 trillion the government owes to itself? That's even more insidious. The government borrowed from Social Security. They took the surplus that workers paid in over decades and spent it on other programs. They left IOUs in the trust fund. When Social Security needs to redeem those bonds to pay benefits, which is happening now as boomers retire, where does the government get the money? They either raise taxes on current workers or issue new debt, which means younger generations pay twice. Once for their own eventual benefits, and again to cover the bonds their parents' generation was supposed to receive. It's an intergenerational wealth transfer disguised as a retirement program. Now, scale this model globally. Japan's $9 trillion in debt, mostly held by Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan, which is effectively part of the government. But here's the trick. The Bank of Japan creates yen to buy Japanese government bonds. The government spends that yen, and Japanese taxpayers service the interest forever. Same mechanism, different currency. Europe's 14 trillion held by European banks, the European Central Bank, and increasingly by the same American asset managers we just discussed. BlackRock doesn't just dominate US markets. They're the largest asset manager on the planet. They hold government bonds from dozens of countries. Every country pays interest. And all of that interest flows into their management fees and returns to their shareholders. China presents an interesting variation. Their debt is mostly domestic, held by state-owned banks. But those banks are ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party elite. So the interest flows from Chinese workers through taxation to state institutions controlled by the political elite. Different structure, same result. Wealth flowing upward to whoever controls the debt instruments. And here's where the interconnection becomes critical. Japan holds over $1 trillion in US Treasury securities. China holds nearly that much. The US holds European bonds through its participation in institutions like the IMF. Europe holds debt from developing nations through the World Bank. It's completely circular. Everyone owes everyone, which means default anywhere threatens the entire structure. Think about what happens if one major player tries to break free. Say, Japan decides it's done with this game and announces it won't roll over its debt, won't buy new bonds, and wants repayment. The US would have to find other buyers for trillions in bonds. Interest rates would spike, which would make US debt service costs explode, which would require either massive tax increases or massive spending cuts or massive inflation through money printing. Any of those options would crash the economy. Which would crash the global economy, because the US economy is the foundation of the global system. So Japan can't actually demand repayment without destroying itself in the process. Same logic applies everywhere. Every major economy is locked into the system through mutual indebtedness. This is Rothschild's innovation operating on a global scale. The web of debt is so complex and interconnected that breaking any strand threatens to unravel the entire structure. Now here's why the debt can never be paid down, even if politicians wanted to. The money supply itself is created through debt. When the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply, it buys government bonds. It creates new money out of nothing and uses that money to purchase bonds from banks. Those banks now have new money to lend out. That money gets deposited in other banks, who lend out most of it again. Through fractional reserve banking, that initial money creation multiplies through the system. But here's the critical point. If the government paid off its debt, that process would reverse. The Fed would sell bonds back to banks. Money would be destroyed as the Fed removed it from circulation. The money supply would contract. There would be fewer dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. That's deflation. And deflation is economically catastrophic. It makes debts harder to pay because the money you owe is worth more than the money you borrowed. It encourages hoarding because your money gains value just by holding it. Economic activity freezes. This nearly happened during the late 1990s under Clinton. The government briefly ran budget surpluses. The national debt started declining slightly, and financial markets panicked. There weren't enough new treasury bonds being issued. Institutional investors who needed safe assets to balance their portfolios didn't have anywhere to put their money. The Fed had to intervene to calm markets. Within a few years, the government was back to deficit spending. The debt resumed growing, and markets stabilized. This reveals the uncomfortable truth. The system requires continuous debt growth, not because politicians are irresponsible, though many are, but because the financial system itself is built on debt as its foundation. Money is debt. Debt is money. You can't have one without the other in this system. So, when politicians talk about balancing the budget, or paying down the debt, they're either lying or they don't understand the system they're operating within. The debt can't be paid down without collapsing the money supply. It can only grow. The only question is how fast it grows and who benefits from that growth. And who benefits? The institutions holding the bonds. BlackRock manages over 10 trillion in assets. Vanguard manages over 7 trillion. State Street over 4 trillion. Fidelity over 4 trillion. These four institutions alone control more than $25 trillion. They don't own all of it directly. They manage it for others. But they collect fees on all of it. And they make the decisions about where it gets invested. A huge portion goes into government bonds. Safe, reliable, backed by the taxing power of governments. That $1 trillion in annual interest on U.S. debt, a significant portion flows through these asset managers. They collect their management fees, typically 0.5 to 2%, depending on the fund. On trillions in assets, those fees add up to tens of billions annually. And that's just from management fees, not counting the returns paid to shareholders of these firms. This is the largest continuous wealth transfer in human history. Larger than any colonial extraction. Larger than any robbery or conquest. And it's completely legal, completely systematic, and completely invisible to most people because it doesn't look like theft. It looks like boring financial management, interest payments, bond yields, asset allocation. The language itself is designed to make your eyes glaze over so you don't look too closely at where the money is actually going. 4 architects across 3 centuries, each one solving a problem, each solution benefiting the banking class, each innovation building on the previous one until the trap became total. Patterson made debt permanent instead of temporary. Rothschild made it interconnected instead of individual. Morgan made it infinite instead of limited. Volcker made it inescapable instead of something you could default on. The result is 315 trillion in global debt that will never be repaid, that pays interest continuously, and that traps every government and every citizen in a system they can't escape without destroying the economic infrastructure modern life depends on. The trap is complete. Everyone on Earth is caught inside it. And the people who designed it, or rather, their institutional successors, collect the rent every single day. If this changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that 38 trillion isn't an accident or a mistake, but a system working exactly as designed, then you're starting to see how power actually operates. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who's running it, because they're not teaching you this in school. They're going to teach you that debt is a problem that needs solving. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem. It's the foundation of the entire structure. And interest is the rent we all pay for living in their system.